3 of our history of Halacha. So we were talking about how the oral Torah keeps expanding. Just to go over that concept quickly, it's like this. We have the idea that Moshe receives the basic oral Torah at Sinai. And what do we mean by the basic oral Torah? Is Hashem explains to Moshe how to read the words of the Torah and what they mean. And he also gives Moshe Midot Hadrash. He gives him methodologies for understanding the psukim, like Kal V'chomer, like Gzera Shava, like Klal Uprat, and so forth. Hopefully one time I'll do a separate set of videos on each of the Midot Hadrash. For the moment though, he gets these Midot Hadrash, and we talked about last time how in each generation then the Shoftim, the judges, would, when a case came before them, if it wasn't something that had already been adjudicated or it wasn't something that had been brought down from Moshe Sinai directly, then they would look into the Torah and look at the appropriate verses, and they would use Midot Hadrash to understand more about the verses. They would say, the verse means this, and it's appropriate for our case right now. And then if there was a machloket between them, let's say if we had two judges that disagreed, machloket is a disagreement. If they had two judges that disagreed, so then you always had to have at least one more judge, a third judge, on a panel to be machriya, to decide between them. And he would either go like one or the other. And if they couldn't all three agree, or let's say even if 2 out of 3 couldn't agree, let's say each of them had a separate opinion, you would bring 2 more judges until you get a majority opinion that agrees on one particular opinion. So what does it mean agrees on one particular opinion? So again, let's say we have a particular question, we're looking at a particular verse, and we have Judge A, he says, I'm going to judge it based on a certain methodology, and another judge says, no, I'm going to use a different methodology, and then there's a whole argument between them and the other judges until they decide on like one or the other. Either everybody agrees with the same opinion, or majority of the rabbis, the majority of the shoftim, the majority of the judges agree on one, and then you have a minority opinion that's a different opinion, and that will still be remembered. We'll remember that one because it's a legitimate opinion, but it's not necessarily the opinion that we will use for halacha. Okay, so now if you can imagine, in each generation you have more and more opinions because we're dealing with more and more questions that come up. Every generation there'll be more and more cases brought before the court, more and more questions about different halachot, and in every generation the judges have to decide what is the halacha. So this is how we left off last time. We said that this oral Torah keeps expanding because more and more questions are answered. So now, the oral Torah is supposed to be learned orally. You're supposed to remember it all by heart. But now it's getting really big. So how do you remember it by heart? So we could imagine it as follows. The way until now, maybe it was remembered by heart, is simply this. You sat down with a Sefer Torah, and you sat down and you were learning pasuk by pasuk, and for each pasuk you memorized what all the meanings of that pasuk are. But now let's say you want to learn Hilchot Pesach. You want to learn all the halachot of Pesach. So what's the problem? You have psukim, you have verses about Pesach in the book of Shemot, and in the book of Vayikra, and in the book of Bamidbar, and in the book of Dvarim, sometimes even in more than one place. So just to learn Hilchot Pesach, you're going to have to learn a few verses here, and then you have to scroll through, and you have to learn a few more verses here, and scroll through, and it's like they're all scattered all over the place. So at some point, the rabbis think there's a better way of doing this, and we will conceptualize, we'll put all of the halachot that deal with one issue, we'll learn them all together. So let's say all of Hilchot Pesach, we'll learn all of the halachot of Pesach together. And now that we've developed all of these halachot, because over all these generations we've been dealing with the meanings of the verses and new questions that came up from year to year, what we're going to do, we'll put all of those, we'll just take all of the conclusions and put them together. And we won't even mention the verses, because everybody can look in the Torah and look at the verses. We'll just bring the conclusions. This now becomes what we would call a masechet, a tractate, that deals with one basic subject. In this case, let's say Pesach. And what order will we put it in? So Chazal decided, let's say if we're talking about the holidays, we'll put them in chronological order. We'll put all the halachot in the order as you would observe them. So let's say Hilchot Pesach, we'll start off with the day before Pesach, when we have to do b'dikat chametz, when we have to start to check the house before Pesach, we have to check it for chametz. That's the first thing we'll talk about. Then we'll talk about what we do the next morning when we burn the chametz. Then we'll talk about what we do in the afternoon when we prepare the korban, the sacrifice for Pesach. And then we'll talk about what we do at night. And so it'll go through chronologically. And that way we'll cover all of the halachot. This basic concept of taking all of the halachot that we learned that were based on verses and then based on the midot hadrash and all the different diunim, all the different discussions that took place over many, many generations, putting them all in an order, a logical order, this is the basis of Mishnah. This is how Mishnah comes about. Mishnah, in other words, is the oral Torah that's now been put into a logical order, so it's easy to remember, and it also now doesn't have any of the verses from the Torah. It's assumed that you already know all the verses. So that's the basic Mishnah.